It was a chilly Friday evening in a small, quiet town where nothing much ever happened. O'Malley's Pub, the local watering hole, stood at the corner of Main Street, its neon sign flickering softly against the darkening sky. Inside, the air smelled of stale beer and fried food, and the faint hum of conversation mixed with the twang of country music playing on the jukebox. It was the kind of place where people came to unwind after a long week. Farmers, mechanics, shopkeepers, and regulars who had been sitting on the same bar stools for decades. At one end of the bar sat an old man, his face lined with wrinkles that told stories of battles fought and memories cherished. His name was Walter Jenkins, an 84-year-old Korean War veteran. He wasn't the type to draw attention to himself. Most nights, he'd sit quietly in his usual spot, nursing a single glass of whiskey while listening to the younger folks swap tales about work, sports, or whatever else came to mind. Walter rarely joined in. Instead, he kept to himself, occasionally nodding along when someone cracked a joke or shared something funny. Tonight, though, things felt different. The pub was busier than usual thanks to a group of bikers who had rolled into town earlier that day. They called themselves the Iron Horse Crew, and they weren't exactly known for being friendly. Dressed head to toe in black leather vests covered in patches of skulls, flames, and other intimidating symbols, they swaggered into the pub like they owned the place. Their loud laughter echoed through the room, drowning out the music and making the regular patrons uneasy. People exchanged nervous glances but said nothing. Nobody wanted trouble with these guys. Walter didn't pay them much attention at first. He'd seen plenty of rough characters in his lifetime, both during the war and afterward, and learned early on that sometimes the best way to avoid conflict was to stay out of it altogether. So, he sipped his drink slowly, leaning slightly forward on his elbows as if trying to shrink into himself. But fate has a funny way of pulling you into situations whether you want to be involved or not. The trouble started when one of the bikers, a burly guy with tattoos snaking up his arms, tripped over Walter's cane, which had been resting against the side of his stool. The biker stumbled backward, knocking over a nearby table and sending glasses crashing to the floor. For a moment, there was complete silence as everyone turned to see what would happen next. Walter looked up, startled, and muttered a quick apology, even though it clearly wasn't his fault. Instead of accepting the apology, the biker sneered down at him. "Watch where you put your junk, old man," he growled, kicking the cane away so it skittered across the floor. Walter blinked, surprised by the hostility, but didn't say anything. He figured it was better to let it slide and hope the guy would move on. Unfortunately, that's not how things played out. Jake Malone, the leader of the Iron Horse Crew, stepped forward. Tall and broad-shouldered, he carried himself with an air of authority that demanded respect, or fear. His piercing eyes scanned the room before landing on Walter, who was now struggling to bend down and retrieve his cane without falling off his stool. Jake smirked, clearly enjoying the spectacle. Then, without warning, he gave Walter a hard shove. The force of the push sent Walter tumbling backward, his frail body hitting the floor with a sickening thud. Gasps rippled through the crowd as the old man lay there, clutching his side and grimacing in pain. No one moved to help him, not right away. The bikers laughed among themselves, treating the whole thing like some kind of twisted game. The rest of the patrons froze, too scared to intervene. After all, standing up to the Iron Horse Crew could mean risking more than just embarrassment. It could mean getting hurt. But amidst the chaos, one person couldn't stay silent any longer. A young waitress named Emily, who had been refilling drinks at a nearby table, rushed over to Walter's side. She knelt beside him, her hands trembling as she helped him sit up. "Are you okay?" she asked gently, her voice barely above a whisper. Walter nodded weakly, though it was obvious he was shaken. Emily's heart raced as she looked around the room. How could no one do anything? This wasn't just any elderly man being bullied. It was a veteran, someone who had risked everything to protect the freedoms they all enjoyed today. Her grandfather had served in World War II, and growing up she'd heard countless stories about the sacrifices soldiers made. Seeing Walter treated this way made her blood boil. As she helped him to his feet, Emily leaned close and whispered, "Don't worry, sir, this isn't over." Her words were soft, but her tone was firm. Walter glanced at her, confusion etched on his face, but he didn't argue. Together they shuffled toward the door, leaving behind a room full of stunned faces and guilty consciences. Outside, the cool night air hit them like a slap. Walter steadied himself against the brick wall of the pub, still holding his side. Emily pulled out her phone, her fingers flying across the screen as she dialed a number she knew by heart. When the call connected, she spoke quickly, her voice shaking with anger and urgency. "Danny, listen carefully," she began. "Something happened at O'Malley's. It's bad." What Emily didn't realize at that moment was that her simple phone call would set off a chain reaction unlike anything the town had ever seen. Little did anyone know justice was coming, and it would arrive faster than anyone expected. Emily's hands trembled as she held the phone to her ear. The cool night air did little to calm her racing heart. She glanced over at Walter, who was leaning against the wall of the pub, his face pale and drawn. He looked like he was trying to catch his breath, but there was something else in his expression. Resignation, maybe, or sadness. It broke her heart to see him like this. "Come on. Pick up," she muttered under her breath. Finally, the line clicked, and a familiar voice answered. "Hey, Em, what's wrong?" Her brother Danny sounded tired, like he'd just finished a long day, but Emily didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Danny, listen carefully," she said, her voice tight with urgency. "Something happened at O'Malley's. It's bad." She quickly explained what had gone down inside. The bikers, the shove, the way no one had stepped in to help Walter. "It's not just anyone they messed with, Danny. This guy is a veteran, a real hero, and they treated him like trash." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and for a moment Emily worried that Danny might brush it off. But then she heard him take a deep breath. "Where are you now?" he asked, his tone shifting from casual to serious. "We're outside, the pub. Walter's okay, he's standing, but he's pretty shaken up. I don't know what to do, Danny. Nobody in there did anything to stop them. They're still laughing about it." Danny didn't respond right away, but Emily could practically hear the gears turning in his head. He was a lieutenant in the Army Reserve stationed nearby at Fort Liberty. She knew he took things like honor and respect seriously, especially when it came to veterans. Growing up, their dad had drilled those values into them, always reminding them that soldiers deserved nothing less than the utmost respect. "I'll handle it," Danny said finally, his voice firm. "Stay with him, Em. Don't let him out of your sight. I mean it." Before Emily could ask what he meant, the line went dead. She stared at her phone for a second, then slipped it back into her pocket. Turning to Walter, she forced a small smile. "Help is on the way," she told him. "You're not alone in this." Walter blinked at her, his eyes clouded with confusion. "What kind of help?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Emily hesitated. How could she explain that her brother was about to mobilize an entire unit of soldiers? Instead, she just patted his shoulder gently. "You'll see," she said. "Just trust me." Meanwhile, Danny was already moving. He hung up the phone and immediately dialed his commanding officer. It wasn't protocol to call this late, but he didn't care. This wasn't just some bar fight. It was an attack on someone who had given years of his life to protect the country. If that didn't warrant action, Danny didn't know what did. When the colonel picked up, Danny wasted no time explaining the situation. "Sir, we've got a problem," he began, his words clipped and precise. "A veteran was assaulted tonight at a local pub. From what my sister says, it sounds like it was deliberate and disrespectful. We need to send a message." The colonel listened silently, his expression unreadable even over the phone. When Danny finished, there was a long pause, then, "Are you sure about this, Lieutenant?" "Yes, sir," Danny replied without hesitation. "If we don't step in, who will? These guys walked all over him because they thought they could get away with it. If we don't show up, they'll think they were right." Another pause. Then the colonel sighed. "All right, get your team ready. I'm coming with you." Danny felt a surge of relief and pride. This was exactly why he joined the military. Not for glory or adventure, but to stand up for people like Walter, to remind everyone that certain lines couldn't be crossed. not without consequences. Within minutes, orders were being issued. Soldiers scrambled to gear up, engines roared to life, and helicopters prepped for takeoff. Word spread quickly through the base about where they were headed and why. Some of the younger recruits looked nervous. They weren't used to deploying for something like this, but others seemed energized. They understood the stakes. This wasn't just about teaching a group of bikers a lesson. It was about showing the world that disrespecting a veteran wouldn't be tolerated. Not here. Not ever. As the convoy rolled out of the gates, Danny found himself gripping the steering wheel tighter than usual. He kept thinking about Walter, about how frail he must have looked lying on that pub floor, about how it probably brought back memories of battles fought decades ago, only to come home and face cruelty instead of gratitude. Danny clenched his jaw. Whoever those bikers were, whatever they thought they were doing, they had no idea what they were messing with. Back at O'Malley's, the mood inside the pub hadn't improved much since Emily and Walter left. The bikers were still holding court, laughing and drinking like nothing had happened. The rest of the patrons avoided eye contact, pretending not to notice the tension in the air. But outside, the first faint rumble of rotors began to echo across the parking lot. At first, no one paid attention. Maybe it was just a distant plane passing overhead. But then the sound grew louder, closer, until it was impossible to ignore. Heads turned toward the windows as headlights swept across the lot, followed by the unmistakable silhouette of a Black Hawk helicopter descending from the sky. For a moment, the entire pub froze. Even the bikers stopped mid-laugh, their smirks fading into expressions of shock and disbelief. What the hell was going on? One of them stood up abruptly, knocking over a chair in the process. "What is that?" he demanded, pointing toward the window. No one answered. Everyone was too busy staring wide-eyed as soldiers poured out of the chopper, their boots hitting the pavement with precision and purpose. Outside, Emily saw the commotion and grabbed Walter's arm. "Come on," she urged, pulling him closer, to the scene unfolding before them. "This is it." Walter squinted at the soldiers, his jaw dropping slightly. "Is this for me?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Emily nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "Yeah," she whispered. "This is for you." Inside the pub, panic started to set in. The bikers exchanged panicked glances, suddenly realizing they were completely surrounded. There was no back door, no escape route. One of them tried to bolt anyway, only to find himself face to face with a soldier blocking the exit. Others raised their hands instinctively, unsure of what else to do. And just like that, the tables had turned. The men who had strutted into O'Malley's like kings now looked like cornered animals, their bravado evaporating in the face of disciplined authority. For the first time that night, justice felt within reach. But this wasn't just about punishing the guilty. As the soldiers moved in, their presence sent a clear message, not just to the bikers, but to everyone watching. Respect mattered. Honor mattered. And if you forgot that, there would always be someone willing to remind you. The sight of the Black Hawk helicopter descending into the parking lot of O'Malley's pub was something no one in the small town would ever forget. The ground vibrated under the force of the rotors, and the noise drowned out everything else. The chatter inside the bar, the hum of the jukebox, even the nervous whispers of the patrons who had stepped outside to see what was happening. Soldiers spilled out of the chopper with military precision, their boots pounding against the asphalt as they formed a tight perimeter around the building. For the townsfolk, it felt surreal, like watching a scene from an action movie unfold, right in front of them. But this wasn't Hollywood. It was real life. And at the center of it all stood Walter Jenkins, leaning heavily on his cane, his face pale but resolute. He looked smaller than ever next to the towering figures in uniform, yet there was a quiet dignity about him that commanded respect. Emily stayed close by his side, her hand resting lightly on his arm as if to steady him, or maybe herself. Inside the pub, chaos erupted. The bikers scrambled to their feet, knocking over chairs and tables in their haste to figure out what was going on. Their leader Jake barked orders, his voice sharp and panicked. "What the hell is this? Who called these guys?" he demanded. glaring at the frightened regulars. No one answered. They were too busy staring out the windows, watching as soldiers surrounded the building with an efficiency that left no room for doubt. Escape wasn't an option. One of the younger bikers made a run for the back door, only to find it blocked by two soldiers armed with rifles. He froze, hands raised instinctively above his head. "We didn't do anything," he shouted, his voice cracking. The soldier closest to him didn't respond, simply nodding toward the wall where he was instructed to stand. Slowly, reluctantly, the biker complied, joining the others who were already lined up, their bravado replaced by wide-eyed fear. Outside, the commanding officer strode toward Walter, his posture ramrod straight, his expression unreadable. When he stopped in front of the elderly veteran, he snapped a crisp salute. "Sir," he said, his voice carrying just enough authority to make everyone within earshot pay attention. "I'm Colonel Reed. We're here to ensure justice is served." Walter blinked, taken aback by the sudden show of respect. For decades, he'd lived quietly, avoiding the spotlight. Now, here he was, standing in the middle of what could only be described as a full-blown military operation, all because of him. His throat tightened, and for a moment he couldn't find the words to respond. Instead, he nodded slowly, his grip tightening on his cane. Emily squeezed his arm gently, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "You deserve this, Mr. Jenkins," she whispered, loud enough for only him to hear. Walter glanced at her, then back at the colonel, who was now issuing orders to his team. The soldiers moved like a well-oiled machine, securing the area and ensuring no one tried anything stupid. It was clear they weren't taking any chances. As the situation unfolded, the townspeople began to gather outside, drawn by the commotion. Some had been inside the pub earlier, too afraid to intervene when the bikers shoved Walter. Others had heard the noise and come running, curious to see what all the fuss was about. Now they stood in stunned silence, watching as the bikers were led out one by one, their leather vests and tough guy facades doing nothing to shield them from the consequences of their actions. Jake was the last to emerge, flanked by two soldiers. His face was red with anger, but there was also a flicker of fear in his eyes. He scanned the crowd looking for support or sympathy, but found none. Even his own gang members avoided meeting his gaze. As he passed Walter, he muttered something under his breath, but the old man didn't react. He simply stared straight ahead, his jaw set firm. Colonel Reed turned to address the crowd. "This kind of behavior won't be tolerated," he announced, his voice ringing out across the parking lot. "Respect isn't just a word. It's something we owe to each other, especially to those who've sacrificed so much for our freedom. Tonight, we're making sure that message gets through." His words sent a ripple through the gathered crowd. Heads nodded in agreement, and murmurs of approval spread like wildfire. For many, it was a wake-up call, a reminder of the values they claimed to hold dear, but often failed to act on. The sight of soldiers standing up for Walter stirred something deep inside them, a mix of pride and shame that left them vowing to do better. Meanwhile, Walter remained quiet, letting the events wash over him. He wasn't used to being the center of attention, and honestly, he didn't want to be. All he wanted was to go home, crawl into bed, and forget about the night's ordeal. But he knew this wasn't just about him anymore. It was about sending a message, not just to the bikers, but to everyone who thought they could treat others however they pleased without facing repercussions. As the soldiers finished rounding up the Iron Horse crew, one of the younger recruits approached Walter hesitantly. He couldn't have been more than 20, his uniform still stiff with newness. "Sir," he said, saluting awkwardly. "Thank you for your service." His voice wavered slightly, betraying how nervous he was, but his sincerity shone through. Walter smiled faintly, touched by the gesture. "Thank you, son," he replied, his voice soft but steady. "But I didn't do anything special. Just did my job." The young soldier shook his head. "That's not true, sir. You gave everything so we could live free. We owe you more than we can ever repay." With that, he stepped back, snapping another salute before hurrying off to rejoin his unit. Emily watched the exchange, her heart swelling with emotion. She glanced at Walter, who seemed lost in thought. "They're right, you know," she said softly. "You're a hero, whether you like it or not." Walter chuckled dryly. "Hero? Nah, I'm just an old man trying to get by." "You're more than that," Emily insisted, "and tonight proves it." By the time the soldiers loaded the bikers into waiting vehicles and prepared to leave, the parking lot was buzzing with conversation. Neighbors who hadn't spoken in years exchanged nods of mutual understanding. Strangers introduced themselves to Walter, thanking him for his service and apologizing for not stepping in sooner. Even the bartender came outside offering free drinks to anyone who wanted to toast the veteran. Colonel Reed approached Walter one last time before heading back to the chopper. "Sir," he said, extending a hand, "we'll take care of the rest. You focus on getting some rest." Walter shook the colonel's hand, gratitude shining in his eyes. "Thank you," he said simply, "for everything." With that, the soldiers boarded the helicopter, its rotors spinning faster as it lifted off the ground. The crowd watched, in silence, until it disappeared into the night sky, leaving behind a sense of awe and a renewed commitment to standing up for what was right. For Walter, the evening had been overwhelming, but it wasn't over yet. As he turned to leave, leaning on both his cane and Emily's supportive arm, he realized something important. Sometimes even the smallest acts of courage could spark change. And maybe, just maybe, this was the start of something bigger. The morning after the dramatic events at O'Malley's pub, the small town buzzed with a mix of disbelief and pride. People gathered in coffee shops, grocery stores, and even gas stations to talk about what had happened. It wasn't every day that a Black Hawk helicopter descended into a sleepy little community, let alone because of an elderly veteran who had been treated so poorly. The story spread like wildfire, fueled by whispers, social media posts, and local news outlets eager to cover the unprecedented event. Jake and his biker gang were now behind bars, facing multiple charges ranging from assault to public disturbance. Their arrest hadn't just been a quick booking, it was a spectacle. Images of soldiers leading them out of the pub in handcuffs circulated online, sparking outrage across the region. Many people expressed relief that justice had finally caught up with the notorious group, while others admitted they'd always been too afraid to stand up to them. Now, it seemed, fear had given way to accountability. For Walter Jenkins, however, life didn't immediately return to normal. If anything, it became busier and noisier than he'd ever imagined. Strangers began showing up at his modest home, some bringing flowers, others offering heartfelt apologies for not stepping in when he needed help. At first, Walter tried to brush off the attention, insisting he was fine and didn't need any fuss. But as more people knocked on his door, he realized this wasn't just about him anymore. This was about something bigger, a reckoning of sorts for the entire town. One visitor, a retired schoolteacher named Margaret, summed it up perfectly during her visit. "You know, Mr. Jenkins," she said, sitting across from him in his living room, "this whole thing has made us look at ourselves differently. We've all been guilty of looking the other way when we should have spoken up. Last night reminded us that silence can be just as harmful as the wrong itself." Walter nodded thoughtfully, though he still struggled to see himself as anything more than an ordinary man. "I'm no hero," he told her. "I was just trying to enjoy my evening. None of this was supposed to happen." Margaret smiled gently. "Maybe not. But sometimes heroes aren't the ones who choose the spotlight. They're the ones who end up in it despite themselves." As the days passed, Walter found himself becoming the face of a movement he never intended to lead. Local leaders organized meetings to discuss ways to support veterans better, ensuring they felt valued and respected in the community. Schools invited him to speak to students about his experiences during the Korean War, hoping to teach younger generations about sacrifice and service. Even businesses pitched in, offering discounts or free services to veterans as a gesture of gratitude. Emily played a key role in keeping Walter grounded through it all. She visited him almost daily, helping him sort through the flood of invitations and well wishes. "You don't have to say yes to everything," she reminded him one afternoon as they sat together on his porch. But maybe you could pick a few things that feel right. You've earned this moment. Walter sighed, leaning back in his chair. I don't know, Emily. All I wanted was a quiet life. Now it feels like everyone's watching me. I get that, she replied softly. But think about it this way, you've given people hope. They see you standing tall after everything that happened, and it inspires them to do better. Isn't that worth a little noise? He chuckled, shaking his head. You sure know how to twist my arm. Despite his reluctance, Walter agreed to attend a town hall meeting organized in his honor. The event drew hundreds of people, far more than the organizers had anticipated. Veterans, families, and curious residents packed the auditorium, eager to hear what Walter had to say. When he walked onto the stage, slowly but steadily, leaning on his cane, the crowd erupted into applause. For several minutes he stood there, overwhelmed by the outpouring of love and respect. When the clapping finally subsided, Walter cleared his throat and began to speak. His voice was soft but steady, carrying the weight of years lived and lessons learned. I didn't plan for any of this, he admitted, gesturing toward the crowd. If I'm being honest, I'd rather be home right now, reading a book or listening to the radio, but here we are. The audience laughed lightly, easing the tension in the room. Encouraged, Walter continued. What happened at the pub? It wasn't just about me. It was about reminding ourselves of who we are and what we stand for. Respect, honor, courage. These aren't just words, they're actions. And if we forget that, we lose something important. His words struck a chord, prompting nods and murmurs of agreement throughout the auditorium. He went on to share snippets of his time in the military, describing the camaraderie among soldiers and the sacrifices they made, not just on the battlefield, but afterward, adjusting to civilian life. By the end of his speech, there wasn't a dry eye in the house. Afterward, people lined up to shake his hand, thank him, or simply hug him. One young boy, no older than 10, approached shyly, clutching a handmade card decorated with stars and stripes. Thank you for fighting for us, sir, he said, his cheeks flushed with embarrassment. Walter knelt down, ignoring the ache in his knees, and accepted the card with a smile. You're welcome, son, he replied, and thank you for remembering. Meanwhile, the fallout from Jake and his gang's actions continued to ripple through the town. Some members of the Iron Horse crew faced additional scrutiny when investigators discovered ties to illegal activities beyond the bar incident. Their reputation, once feared, crumbled under the weight of public condemnation. Other biker groups distanced themselves, unwilling to associate with men who had brought shame to their subculture. For the townspeople, the aftermath served as a turning point. Conversations shifted from gossip to action. Volunteers formed committees dedicated to improving conditions for veterans, from organizing job fairs to creating mentorship programs. Others focused on fostering unity within the community, hosting events designed to bring neighbors together. Slowly but surely, the town began to heal and grow stronger. Even those who hadn't known Walter before the incident felt inspired to make changes in their own lives. A mechanic started offering free car repairs to veterans. A local artist painted a mural honoring service members, which quickly became a landmark. Small acts of kindness multiplied, proving that even the simplest gestures could create ripples of positivity. Through it all, Walter remained humble, deflecting praise whenever possible. I'm just one man, he often said. This is about all of us coming together. Yet deep down, he couldn't deny the impact the past week had on him. For the first time in years, he felt seen, not as an old man fading into obscurity, but as someone whose contributions mattered. It was a feeling he hadn't realized he'd missed until now. As the sun set on another day, Walter sat on his porch, watching the world go by. Emily joined him, carrying 2 cups of tea. How are you holding up? She asked, handing him one of the steaming mugs. Better than I expected, he admitted, taking a sip. It's strange, isn't it? One bad night turned into, well, all of this. She grinned. Sometimes change starts with something unexpected. You showed people what courage looks like, whether you meant to or not. Walter chuckled, gazing out at the horizon. Courage, huh? I suppose I'll take it. They sat in comfortable silence, the sounds of laughter and conversation drifting in from nearby streets. Life in the town would never be the same again, and that, Walter realized, was a good thing. The weeks following the incident at O'Malley's pub marked a turning point not just for Walter Jenkins, but for the entire town. What had started as an ugly confrontation in a dimly lit bar transformed into something far greater, a collective awakening. People who had once kept their heads down and avoided trouble now found themselves asking hard questions. How could they have let things go so wrong? Why hadn't they stood up sooner? And most importantly, how could they ensure it never happened again? For Walter, the attention didn't fade quickly. If anything, it grew stronger. Strangers continued to approach him wherever he went, whether he was buying groceries, walking his dog, or sitting on his porch reading the morning paper. Some came bearing gifts, pies, quilts, even handmade cards from schoolchildren. Others simply wanted to shake his hand or share a story about someone in their family who had served. Walter tried to stay gracious, thanking each person with a nod and a smile. But privately, he worried that people were putting too much weight on his shoulders. It's like they're looking for permission to be better, Emily said one evening, as she helped Walter sort through another stack of letters and packages. They'd taken over his dining table, which groaned under the weight of envelopes, care packages, and notes scrawled on lined notebook paper. Permission? Walter asked, raising an eyebrow. He leaned back in his chair, wincing slightly as his old bones protested the movement. What do you mean? I mean, you've given them hope, Emily explained, setting aside a letter adorned with glitter glue and drawings of American flags. They see what happened to you, and instead of feeling powerless, they feel inspired. Like maybe they can make a difference too. Walter frowned, rubbing the bridge of his nose. I didn't ask for any of this, Em. I'm just an old man trying to live quietly. I know, she said softly. But sometimes life doesn't give us what we want. It gives us what we need. Maybe this is your chance to leave behind something bigger than yourself. Her words lingered in the air between them, heavy but true. Walter knew deep down that she was right. This wasn't just about him anymore, it was about the ripple effect his story had created. Still, the pressure weighed on him. He wasn't used to being anyone's hero. Around the same time, the town decided to honor Walter officially. The mayor called a meeting with local leaders, veterans groups, and community members to plan a ceremony that would recognize not only Walter's bravery, but also the sacrifices of all veterans. It was scheduled to take place at the town hall, a historic building with tall white columns and a grand staircase perfect for speeches and photo opportunities. Flyers went up around town announcing the event, and within days, RSVPs poured in from neighboring counties and beyond. On the day of the ceremony, Walter woke early, feeling a mix of excitement and dread. He dressed carefully, choosing a suit he hadn't worn in years and pinning his medals to his lapel. The weight of them against his chest reminded him of days long past, days filled with both triumph and heartache. As he stood in front of the mirror, adjusting his tie, he couldn't help but wonder if he was ready for what lay ahead. Emily arrived shortly after, her car loaded with flowers and snacks she insisted were necessary, just in case. She fussed over him, straightening his collar and smoothing out imaginary wrinkles in his jacket. You look great, she assured him, stepping back to admire her handiwork. Nervous? Terrified, Walter admitted with a wry smile. I haven't spoken in front of a crowd since, well, ever. You'll do fine, she said firmly. Just talk from the heart. That's all anyone wants. When they arrived at the town hall, the scene outside took Walter's breath away. Hundreds of people had gathered, spilling onto the lawn and sidewalks. Flags fluttered in the breeze and banners hung from lampposts declaring messages like, "Honor our heroes" and "Thank you, veterans." Soldiers in uniform mingled with civilians, sharing stories and laughter. Children ran around holding miniature American flags, their faces painted with red, white, and blue designs. As Walter stepped out of the car, The crowd erupted into applause. He froze for a moment, overwhelmed by the sheer number of people who had come to support him. Emily nudged him gently, whispering, "You've got this." Taking a deep breath, he nodded and began making his way toward the entrance, shaking hands and accepting hugs along the way. Inside, the atmosphere was electric. Rows of chairs stretched across the auditorium, every seat occupied. More people stood along the walls or craned their necks from the balcony above. At the front of the room stood a podium draped with an American flag, flanked by 2 soldiers standing at attention. When Walter entered, escorted by Emily, the room fell silent. All eyes turned to him as he made his slow but steady journey to the stage. Once seated, the ceremony began. Local officials spoke first, praising Walter's courage and resilience. Then came representatives from veterans organizations, each sharing heartfelt tributes. One speaker, a retired colonel, recounted his own experiences during wartime and emphasized the importance of remembering those who had fought, and still fought, for freedom. His words brought tears to many eyes, including Walter's. Finally, it was Walter's turn to speak. As he rose from his chair and walked to the podium, the room erupted into applause once more. He raised a hand, signaling for quiet, and waited until the clapping subsided. For a moment, he simply stood there, gripping the sides of the podium, searching for the right words. Then he began. "I never thought I'd stand here today," he said, his voice steady despite the nerves bubbling beneath the surface. "Not because I didn't believe in doing the right thing, but because I didn't think anyone would notice if I did. I joined the military because I wanted to serve my country, not because I wanted recognition. Yet here we are." He paused, glancing out at the sea of faces before him. What happened at O'Malley's pub wasn't just about me. It was about reminding ourselves of who we are and what we value. Respect, honor, compassion. These aren't just words, they're actions. And when we fail to act, we lose a piece of ourselves. His voice grew stronger as he continued, drawing on memories of his time in service. "I've seen the best and worst of humanity. I've watched men give their lives for strangers they'd never met. And I've seen communities come together to rebuild what war tore apart. We have the power to choose, to lift each other up or tear each other down. Last month, we chose to lift each other up. Let's keep choosing that." By the time he finished, the room was silent except for the sound of sniffles and muffled sobs. When Walter stepped away from the podium, the audience leapt to their feet, cheering and clapping with such enthusiasm that it seemed the building might shake. Tears streamed down faces young and old, and several people rushed forward to embrace him, their gratitude palpable. Afterward, as Walter mingled with attendees, he noticed something remarkable. People weren't just celebrating him, they were celebrating each other. Veterans swapped stories with active duty personnel, parents introduced their children to soldiers, and neighbors exchanged phone numbers, promising to stay connected. The sense of unity was tangible, filling the room with warmth and purpose. One particularly touching moment came when a young girl approached Walter, clutching a homemade quilt in her arms. Her mother nudged her forward, whispering encouragement. "We made this for you," the girl said shyly, holding out the quilt. It was stitched together with patches representing different branches of the military, surrounded by stars and stripes. Walter knelt down to her level, his eyes misty. "This is beautiful," he said, running a hand over the fabric. "Thank you." "It's for keeping us safe," she replied earnestly, "and for showing us how to be brave." Walter smiled, pulling her into a gentle hug. "You're already brave," he told her. "Don't ever forget that." As the evening wound down, Walter found himself reflecting on everything that had transpired. The journey from that fateful night at O'Malley's to this moment had been unexpected, humbling, and transformative. He realized now that while he may have been reluctant to step into the spotlight, his story had ignited something powerful, a renewed commitment to honoring veterans and supporting one another. Standing on the steps of the town hall as the sun dipped below the horizon, Walter felt a strange sense of peace. Life wouldn't go back to the quiet solitude he'd known before. That much was certain. But maybe, Just maybe, that wasn't such a bad thing. In the months that followed the ceremony at the town hall, Walter Jenkins' life settled into a new rhythm, one that was busier and noisier than he'd ever imagined, but also richer in ways he hadn't anticipated. The whirlwind of attention hadn't completely died down, but it had shifted from overwhelming chaos to something more manageable. People still stopped him on the street to thank him or ask how they could help veterans in their community. Strangers sent letters filled with gratitude, some even including photos of loved ones who had served. Walter kept every one of them, tucking them into a shoebox under his bed like treasures. But what surprised him most wasn't the recognition, it was the way his story seemed to spark change. The small town he called home began to transform, not overnight, but gradually as people started taking action instead of just talking about it. Veterans groups formed, organizing job fairs, mentorship programs, and social events designed to bring former service members together. Local businesses stepped up too, offering discounts, free meals, or services specifically for veterans. Even schools got involved, inviting soldiers to speak to students and teaching lessons about military history and sacrifice. Walter found himself playing an unexpected role in all of this. Though he never sought leadership, people looked to him as a symbol of resilience and dignity. He became a quiet advocate, encouraging others to keep pushing forward without letting pride get in the way. "It's not about me," he often said when someone praised him. "It's about making sure nobody feels forgotten." One day, while sitting on his porch sipping coffee, Walter noticed a group of teenagers walking by. They were carrying shovels, rakes, and bags of mulch, heading toward the park where the town's war memorial stood. Curious, he called out to them. "What are you kids up to?" One of the teens turned, grinning. "We're fixing up the memorial, Mr. Jenkins. Our teacher said it needed some TLC, so we thought we'd pitch in." Walter nodded approvingly. "Good work. That place means a lot to a lot of people." The teen shrugged modestly. "We figured if you can stand up to bikers, we can handle a little yard work." Walter chuckled, shaking his head. It was moments like these that reminded him how far-reaching the impact of that night at O'Malley's pub had been. These kids weren't alive during the Korean War, or even close to it, but somehow his story resonated with them. It inspired them to take responsibility for their corner of the world, however small it might seem. As time passed, Walter also noticed changes closer to home. Emily continued to visit regularly, bringing fresh-baked cookies or updates about new initiatives in town. She often teased him about becoming a local celebrity, though there was genuine admiration in her voice. "You've done more good in 6 months than most people do in a lifetime," she told him one afternoon. "Don't give me too much credit," Walter replied with a wry smile. "I'm just trying to keep up with everyone else." Emily laughed. "Still deflecting, huh? Well, I guess that's part of your charm." Despite his humility, Walter couldn't deny the sense of purpose he felt now. For years, he'd lived quietly, content to fade into the background. But the events of the past few months had pulled him back into the light, not because he wanted it, but because he realized he had something to offer. His experiences, his wisdom, and his quiet strength gave others hope, and in turn, their energy and determination gave him a renewed sense of belonging. One particularly poignant moment came when a young man named Tom knocked on Walter's door one Saturday morning. Tom was barely 20, with a buzz cut and a nervous habit of shifting his weight from foot to foot. He introduced himself as a recent enlistee in the Army Reserve, inspired to join after hearing Walter speak at the town hall. "I wanted to meet you," Tom admitted, fidgeting with the brim of his cap. "To say thanks. Hearing your story made me realize why I wanted to serve. To protect people like you." Walter studied the young man for a moment, seeing echoes of his younger self in those earnest eyes. "You'll do great things," he said finally, extending a hand. "Just remember, courage isn't about being fearless. It's about doing the right thing even when you're scared." Tom nodded, visibly moved. "I'll try, sir. I promise." Moments like these stayed with Walter long after the visitors left. They reminded him that his legacy wasn't defined by medals or accolades, It was defined by the lives he touched. And in a way, that felt more meaningful than anything else. Of course, life wasn't perfect. There were still challenges, days when Walter's arthritis flared up, making it hard to walk, or nights when memories of the war crept back into his dreams. But those moments no longer felt isolating. Instead, they became opportunities to connect with others who understood what he was going through. At support group meetings for veterans, he shared stories and listened intently to theirs, finding solace in shared experiences. The town itself continued to grow stronger, united by a newfound sense of purpose. Annual events like Memorial Day, parades took on added significance, drawing larger crowds each year. Neighbors who had once kept to themselves now gathered for potlucks and fundraisers, eager to strengthen the bonds they'd formed. Even the pub where everything had started underwent a transformation. O'Malley's became a gathering spot for veterans and civilians alike, hosting trivia nights and karaoke contests that brought laughter and camaraderie to its once tense atmosphere. For Walter, the biggest change was personal. He no longer felt invisible. Whether he was sharing a meal with Emily, mentoring a young soldier, or simply waving to passers-by from his porch, he knew he mattered. His sacrifices hadn't been forgotten. They'd been celebrated, honored, and used as a catalyst for positive change. On a crisp autumn evening, Walter sat outside watching the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. Emily joined him, handing him a mug of hot cocoa. "Thinking about anything in particular?" she asked, settling into the chair next to him. "Just, everything," Walter replied, taking a sip. "How much has changed since that night? How much we've changed." "You've done good, Walter," Emily said softly. "You know that, right?" He smiled faintly, gazing out at the trees swaying gently in the breeze. "Maybe. Or maybe we all did good together." And perhaps that was the truth. What had started as an act of cruelty had turned into a movement fueled by compassion, unity, and respect. Walter Jenkins wasn't just a veteran anymore. He was a reminder that even the smallest acts of courage could spark something extraordinary. And in a world often divided by fear and indifference, that was a lesson worth remembering.